I went to my son's house for Christmas dinner and never expected a fear for my life. After one sip of water, I felt dizzy and stepped into the kitchen, where I saw something that proved this wasn't an accident. I didn't confront anyone. I stayed calm, gathered proof, and waited because calling 911 too soon would have ended everything before the truth came out. Before I take you through everything, take a second to support this story. Subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching from. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. The lie didn't begin in the kitchen. It started at the table. The dining room glowed with warm light, pine garlands draped across the mantel, and a Christmas centerpiece, so tall it nearly blocked my view of the person across from me, my son, Evan Caldwell. The table was overloaded. Roasted turkey, glazed carrots, fresh bread still steaming. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. Sabrina Caldwell raised her wine glass, the diamond on her finger catching the chandelier light and scattering it across the room. To family, she said smoothly. To success. And to a wonderful Christmas. Evan smiled, that practiced smile I'd seen imperfect over the years. To success? He echoed, glancing at me. It's been a great year. We finally landed a major client. I nodded, lifting my glass of water. 40 years as a forensic accountant had trained me to hear what wasn't being said. Evan's firm was a laptop and a rented office above a closed-down print shop. 6 months earlier, he'd stood in my living room, shoulders slumped, asking for a $50,000 loan to keep the business afloat. A short-term bridge, he called it. Now he was talking about luxury trips to Whistler and a new car parked outside. The math didn't work. Sabrina leaned back in her chair, silk dress perfectly pressed, playing the part of effortless success. The watch on Evan's wrist was worth more than my first car. The performance alone was expensive. That's when I felt it. A tight pressure bloomed in my chest, not sharp, not sudden, just wrong. I set my fork down slowly. The room seemed to tilt, lights blurring together. I took another sip of water, hoping it was just stress, the heavy meal, the long drive. Dad, Evan asked, "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Just need some fresh water." The warmth of the dining room suddenly felt suffocating. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked toward the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last. I gripped the doorway as I crossed into bright, modern space. Stainless steel, white counters, spotless. A show kitchen, like the rest of their lives. I reached for a glass, but my sleeve brushed a messy stack of mail shoved against the counter. Envelopes spilled everywhere. I sighed and bent to gather them. That's when I saw it. An envelope already opened, addressed to me, from Prudential Insurance. My heart slammed hard against my ribs. I hadn't dealt with that company in over a decade. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it crossed a line. But instinct, old, sharp, and rarely wrong, took over. I pulled the paper free. Life insurance policy. Insured, Henry Caldwell. Policy value, $2 million. Beneficiary, Evan Caldwell. My son. The room spun. The pressure in my chest intensified. Sharp now, frighteningly precise. $2 million. Taken out 3 weeks ago. Without my knowledge. I braced myself against the counter, breathing shallow, my mind racing. Evan wasn't just reckless. He was desperate. Then I noticed the bottle. The same water Evan had handed me when I arrived sat half empty by the sink. Next to it, partially hidden behind a marble salt dish, was a small clear vial. No label. Almost empty. Everything clicked at once. The sudden illness. The policy. The vial. The water. This wasn't stress. This was an attempt. Fear surged, but only for a second. Years of discipline took over. I had spent my life exposing fraud, unraveling schemes that relied on panic and mistakes. I forced my breathing to steady. I checked the ceiling corner. A security camera blinked faintly. I needed to look normal. I slid the insurance document back into its envelope and set it down exactly where I found it. Then, calmly, I pocketed the vial. Evidence. I opened the fridge, grabbed a sealed bottle of water, twisted the cap, and drank deeply. Flushed my system. By time, when I returned to the table, Sabrina smiled sweetly. "Feeling better, Henry?" I met Evan's eyes. "Much," I said evenly. "The water helped." He nodded, satisfied. He had no idea the game had changed. The drive home was a blur of headlights and dread. I locked my door behind me and finally let my hand shake. I placed the vial under a bright light, staring at it like it might speak. Calling the police right then would have been a mistake. Accusations without proof were useless. I called the one person I trusted, Thomas Reed, my lawyer and friend of 4 decades. He listened in silence as I laid out the facts. "Hospital. First thing in the morning," he said finally. "Cascade Memorial. Toxicology screen. Don't touch anything else." I didn't sleep. At the hospital, blood tests confirmed it. Amiodarone, a heart medication I'd never been prescribed. In my condition, it could trigger a fatal event that looked natural. A perfect crime. By the time I returned home, I had 3 things laid out on my kitchen table: the insurance policy, the vial, and the toxicology report. Only then did I make the call. "I'd like to report a crime," I said calmly. "Life insurance fraud and an attempt on my life." 2 days later, Detective Aaron Cole stood in my living room. I didn't plead. I didn't speculate. I showed him the evidence. He believed me, and when he said, "This is calculated," I knew Evan had underestimated me. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this wasn't the first move. It was already far too late. And this was only the beginning. Detective Aaron Cole didn't rush. That's what convinced me he understood the gravity of what I'd shown him. He sat at my dining table in Redwood Falls, flipping through the documents with the patience of a man who knew that real crimes didn't need theatrics. The insurance policy, the toxicology report from Cascade Memorial, the vial sealed in a plastic evidence bag. He read every line, twice. "Mr. Caldwell," he finally said, folding his hands, "this isn't a misunderstanding. This is planning." I nodded. That's what scares me most. He asked about Evan's finances. I told him everything, every loan, every excuse, every unexplained upgrade in lifestyle. I didn't offend my son. I didn't accuse him emotionally. I laid out numbers, dates, patterns. That's when Detective Cole leaned back. "People who do this," he said slowly, "don't start with murder. They escalate to it." He stood to leave an hour later, promising discretion. No arrests yet. Quiet investigation. Financial records. Pharmacy trails. Digital footprints. "Act normal," he advised. "If they think you're onto them, they'll panic." I smiled thinly. I've spent my life pretending not to notice lies. That evening, Evan called. "Dad," he said, voice warm, practiced. "Just checking in. You scared us a bit last night." "I'm fine," I replied. "Doctor said it was stress." Sabrina took the phone in the background. "You should stay with us for a few days," she suggested. "Just until you're steady." The offer was almost funny. "I'll be fine at home," I said. "But thank you." They didn't argue. That worried me more than if they had. The next week unfolded slowly and carefully. I went about my routines. Morning walks, grocery runs, coffee at the same diner. I answered Evan's calls politely. I returned Sabrina's messages with neutral warmth. Meanwhile, Detective Cole and his team worked. The first break came from the insurance company. The policy hadn't just been suspicious. It was fraudulent. Evan had signed documents claiming I was present and consenting. A forged signature. A fabricated witness. The agent who processed it admitted Evan had paid extra for expedited approval. Then came the pharmacy records. Amiodarone wasn't easy to obtain, but someone had found a way. An online overseas pharmacy. Payment through a prepaid card, purchase with cash. Shipping address. A P.O. box in Salem, Oregon. Security footage from Pine Street Cafe showed Evan using his laptop at the exact time the P.O. box was registered. Still, Cole wasn't satisfied. "Juries like patterns," he told me. "Not just proof. Motive." So we went digging. Credit cards. Loans. Hidden debt. Evan and Sabrina weren't just living beyond their means. They were buried. Maxed out cards. a second mortgage, a private loan from Tacoma with an interest rate that screamed desperation. $2 million wasn't greed. It was survival. They'd built a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and I was the exit plan. One night, Evan came over unannounced. I saw his car pull up to the window and felt a calm settle over me. Fear had burned itself out days ago. What remained was clarity. "Dad," he said when I opened the door, "you don't look well." "I'm improving," I replied, stepping aside. He sat stiffly on the couch, eyes scanning my living room as if inventorying assets. "Sabrina's worried," he said. "We both are. After what happened." "What happened?" I repeated evenly. He swallowed. "Your heart scare." I watched his hands. Slight tremor. Not concern, stress. "You know," he continued, "we've been thinking, maybe it's time to simplify things. Estate planning. Power of attorney. Just in case." There it was. "I already have arrangements," I said. His eyes flicked up. "With who?" "My lawyer." Evan smiled, but it cracked at the edges. Good. Just want to make sure everything's secure." "For whom?" I asked. He hesitated. "For family." I nodded. "Of course." He left soon after, unsatisfied. That same night, Detective Cole called. "We questioned them," he said, separately. "And..." Sabrina cried. Evan got angry. Both claimed you're confused. They suggested a medical evaluation. I closed my eyes briefly. "They're building a counter-narrative," Cole continued, "painting you as unreliable." "That won't work," I said quietly. "No," he agreed, "not with what we have." 2 days later, Cole asked me something unexpected. "Would you be willing to let this play out a little longer?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They think they're still in control," he said. "If they believe you're isolated and vulnerable, they'll make a mistake." I understood immediately. "They'll try again," I said. "Yes," Cole confirmed. "And when they do, we'll be ready." I agreed. The next Sunday, Sabrina invited me to dinner. "Nothing fancy," she said lightly. "Just family." I accepted. When I arrived, everything looked identical to Christmas. Same table, same lights, same false warmth. Evan poured wine. Sabrina set my glass of water in front of me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I smiled and raised it. "To family," I said. Their relief was visible. That night, after dessert, I excused myself to the bathroom. Inside, my phone vibrated. "Detective Cole, now." I flushed the toilet, washed my hands, and stepped out calmly. Uniformed officers were already outside. When Evan opened the door to them, the color drained from his face. Sabrina screamed. They tried to talk, to explain, to blame. It didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. The second vial found in the trash sealed it. As they were led away, Evan locked eyes with me. "You planned this," he whispered. I shook my head. "You did." I stood alone in the quiet house, the Christmas lights still blinking softly. The holiday was over, and so was the lie. But the consequences were only beginning. The house felt different once the patrol cars pulled away. Quieter, not peaceful, clean, like a room after a long illness finally breaks. I didn't sit down right away. I walked through every room, touching familiar surfaces as if confirming they were real. The arm of the couch where Evan used to sprawl as a teenager. The kitchen counter where Sabrina once laughed too loudly over wine. Everything looked the same. Everything was changed. At 2:14 a.m., Detective Cole called. "They're in custody," he said. "No bail hearing until morning." I closed my eyes. "Thank you. We'll need your statement first thing. Try to rest." I didn't sleep. By morning, the story had already begun to leak. Neighbors whispered. News vans idled at the edge of Redwood Falls like scavengers waiting for motion. I ignored them all and drove to the station with my attorney, Martin Hale, a man who had known me long enough not to ask how I felt. In the interview room, Evan wouldn't look at me. Sabrina did. Her eyes were red but sharp, scanning for weakness. When the detective stepped out, she leaned forward. "You did this to us," she hissed. "No," I said calmly. I stopped you. Evan finally spoke. Dad, why didn't you just help us? I stared at him. You tried to kill me. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what it was like. I almost laughed, but stopped myself. That, I said, is exactly what I understand. They were charged that afternoon. Conspiracy, insurance fraud, attempted homicide. The word sounded clinical, too small for what they meant. The media called it the Christmas poison plot. They didn't call me a hero. They called me lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. The first court hearing was a circus. Sabrina arrived flanked by her attorney. Chin lifted, expression carefully calibrated for cameras. Evan looked diminished, smaller, like someone realizing too late that confidence had been borrowed. When the judge denied bail, Sabrina's composure finally cracked. This is absurd, she snapped. He's confused. He's manipulating the system. The judge didn't blink. 2 weeks passed. I stayed home, changed my routines, ate quietly, read at night, thought about nothing I couldn't survive. Then Martin called. They filed a motion, he said, to challenge your mental capacity. I smiled faintly. Of course they have. It was their last angle. Medical records, evaluations, depositions. I welcomed all of it. The court-appointed neurologist spent 3 hours with me. Memory tests, logic puzzles, financial reasoning. At the end, she removed her glasses. Mr. Caldwell, she said, your cognitive performance is exceptional. That report ended their narrative. But desperation doesn't disappear. It mutates. Sabrina turned on Evan. In exchange for leniency, she claimed the poisoning had been his idea, that she only helped cover debt, that she loved me like a father. Evan countered by producing messages. Her planning, her research, her insistence. The prosecution watched quietly while they destroyed each other. I was asked if I wanted to attend the plea negotiations. I declined. I'd already seen enough. 3 months later, Evan accepted a deal. Guilty plea. Reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. Sabrina refused. She took it to trial. The courtroom was colder than I expected. She sat upright, dressed modestly, eyes downcast until it was time to perform. When she testified, she cried at all the right moments, spoke about pressure, fear, love. Then the prosecution played the recording. Her voice, calm, precise. We just needed to look natural. The room went still. Her lawyer didn't look at her again. The verdict came back unanimous. As she was led away, she turned once more toward me. You think you won, she said bitterly. I met her gaze. No, I survived. That night, I returned home and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photos. Evan as a child, birthday candles, smudged smiles. I didn't cry. I let them be what they were, proof that something once existed, even if it couldn't anymore. 6 months later, the insurance company settled. The policy was voided. Criminal fraud confirmed. No money exchanged hands. That mattered more than any sentence. The house stayed quiet until the phone rang one morning. Unknown number. Mr. Caldwell, a woman asked. My name is Elaine Mercer. I was told you might understand. She paused. My daughter just asked me to sign something, and it didn't feel right. I listened for an hour. When she finished, I said only one thing. Trust that feeling. After I hung up, I sat back and stared at the window as the sun cut across the floor. I hadn't planned this next part, but it was happening anyway. And I realized something then, something that settled deeper than anger ever had. What they tried to take from me wasn't my life. It was my silence. And I wasn't giving that back. Not anymore. The first letter arrived in a pale blue envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded once. Thank you for answering the phone. No signature. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in the drawer beside my desk, the one that had become a quiet archive of things I never asked for but somehow inherited anyway. By the end of the week, there were 4 more calls like Elaine Mercer's. Different voices. Same hesitation. Same fear wrapped in politeness. A nephew who suddenly wanted power of attorney, just in case. A daughter pushing new medications. A grandson insisting on upgrading home security systems. Every story carried the same shape. Concern on the surface. Control underneath. I didn't tell them what to do. I told them what to watch for. Patterns matter. Always have. Word spread faster than I expected. Not through news outlets or social media, but through quiet channels, community centers, legal aid offices, hospital waiting rooms, places where people speak in lowered voices, and trade warnings instead of gossip. One afternoon, Martin called. "You may want to sit down," he said. "I'm sitting." "You've been named in 3 civil filings." I closed my eyes. By whom? By Sabrina. Of course. From prison. She was suing me for emotional distress, defamation, and, this was my favorite, intentional manipulation of law enforcement. "She claims you engineered the situation to frame her," Martin continued. I exhaled slowly. "And Evan, he's cooperating fully with prosecutors. She's on her own." The lawsuits were weak, desperate, but they were also loud. Reporters resurfaced, headlines sharpened. Elderly fathers, calculated trap, questioned. Was it really self-defense? I didn't respond. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has weight. At the preliminary hearing, Sabrina appeared via video link. Prison gray dulled her features, but the edge in her eyes remained intact. She watched me the entire time. When her attorney argued that I had baited them into committing crimes, the judge raised an eyebrow. "By existing?" he asked dryly. The motion was dismissed. Outside the courthouse, a young reporter pushed a microphone toward me. "Mr. Caldwell, do you feel any responsibility for what happened to your son?" I stopped, looked directly into the camera. "I feel responsible for staying alive." That clip aired everywhere. The calls doubled. By early spring, I was spending 2 days a week at the local senior center, not as a speaker, not officially, just sitting at a folding table with coffee, listening. They came with documents, wills, trusts, medical forms. They came with confusion, shame, guilt. "I don't want to believe she'd do that," one man whispered, gripping a manila folder like a life raft. "I didn't either," I said. That was enough. One afternoon, Elaine Mercer drove 3 hours to see me. She was smaller than I imagined, hands trembling as she held her purse. "I confronted her," she said quietly. "My daughter. I asked why she needed access to my accounts. And I asked," she cried. Then she threatened to have me evaluated. Elaine swallowed hard, but I recorded the conversation. I smiled, not because I was happy, because she had learned. The district attorney reached out in April, not officially. Quietly, they were seeing patterns too. Financial exploitation cases rising. Familiar names appearing again and again. "They don't expect resistance," the DA said. "That's the advantage." I didn't correct him. Resistance was only half of it. The other half was patience. Sabrina's trial concluded with sentencing in early May. 17 years. When the judge read it out, Sabrina laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You think this ends me?" she called toward the bench. "You think I'm the villain?" No one answered. On the way out, she caught my eye. "This isn't over," she mouthed. She was wrong. It was already finished. Evan was sentenced a month later. 8 years. He asked to see me beforehand. I agreed. The visitation room smelled like disinfectant and old regret. He sat across from me, thinner, hands folded like a child waiting to be scolded. "I thought I could fix everything," he said. "I thought money would make it better." I nodded. "It never does." "I don't expect forgiveness," he added quickly. I wanted you to know I see it now." I studied his face, tried to find the boy he used to be. "I believe you," I said. That seemed to surprise him more than anger would have. As I stood to leave, he asked one last question. "What are you going to do now?" I paused. "I'm going to keep answering the phone." That summer, the foundation took shape. Not a nonprofit. Not at first. just a network. Retired accountants, former social workers, a nurse who knew hospital systems inside out, a judge who volunteered his evenings to review cases quietly. We didn't advertise. We listened, and when necessary, we intervened. By fall, there were outcomes. Guardianships denied, assets unfrozen, charges filed, families fractured, but safer. One night, I sat alone on my porch as the air cooled and leaves scraped softly across the pavement. The house no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like a place that had survived something. I thought about Sabrina's words. This isn't over. She had mistaken consequence for continuation. Some stories don't keep going. They close. And what comes after isn't the aftermath. It's the correction. The first threat arrived disguised as a thank you. A handwritten card. Cream paper. Careful script. You helped my mother. I won't forget that. No name. No address. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I slipped it into the same drawer as the others. Over time, that drawer had become less of an archive and more of a map. Each item marking a place where something fragile had nearly been broken. 2 days later, the second message came by email. You don't know what you've started. This one wasn't grateful. It came from a burner address, routed through 3 countries and stripped of identifiers. Amateur intimidation. But the timing mattered. It arrived hours after a guardianship petition was denied for a woman in Mesa, one we'd quietly supported. Patterns, again. I forwarded it to Martin with a single line. We're being noticed. He replied 5 minutes later. We already were. Now they're nervous. That autumn, nervousness took on a sharper edge. Banks began flagging unusual activity. Accounts drained just enough to trigger review, then left untouched. Medical providers reported sudden changes in consent forms. Elder law attorneys compared notes and found overlaps they couldn't ignore. Same names, same intermediaries, different families. It wasn't one scheme. It was an ecosystem. The first real crack came from someone inside it. Her name was Lillian Park, mid-40s, former compliance officer for a private wealth advisory firm that specialized in family asset optimization. She contacted me through an intermediary with a simple message. I know how they do it. I helped build the paperwork. We met in a public library cafe. Neutral ground. Fluorescent lights. Too many witnesses for theatrics. She looked exhausted. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. They call it soft transfer, she said, stirring her tea without drinking it. No sudden moves. No direct theft. Just nudges. Adjustments. Influence. How many families? I asked. She hesitated. Enough that I stopped counting. Lillian slid a flash drive across the table. Templates. Scripts. Flowcharts. Everything from the first concerned conversation to filing emergency guardianship petitions. I didn't touch it. Why now? I asked. Her voice dropped. Because someone died last month, and it wasn't supposed to happen. An elderly man in Reno. Complications from medication, changes his daughter insisted on managing. The firm's documents had guided the process. The death triggered a payout, large enough to draw scrutiny. They're scrambling, Lillian said, deleting records, blaming contractors, anyone but themselves. Why come to me? I asked. She met my eyes. Because you survived, and because you didn't cash in. That night, I didn't sleep. I spread the contents of the flash drive across my desk like an autopsy. Every form pristine. Every phrase engineered to sound reasonable. For your safety. Just temporary. Court requires this. The language was cleaner than Sabrina's ever was. More professional. More dangerous. By morning, Martin had looped in federal investigators. Quietly. Very quietly. What followed wasn't dramatic. No raids. No headlines. Just audits. Compliance checks. Licensing reviews. Requests that couldn't be ignored without consequence. The firm Lillian worked for dissolved in 6 weeks. 3 others followed. Some owners fled. Some negotiated. Some tried to threaten. One succeeded. The incident happened on a Thursday evening. I was walking back from the center, coat pulled tight against the cold, when a man stepped out from between parked cars. Late 30s, clean jacket, wrong eyes. "You should stop," he said casually. I didn't answer. "This crusade of yours," he continued. "You're hurting people." I laughed once. Couldn't help it. "People like who?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "People who know things about you." I stopped walking. "About your wife," he added softly. The word hit harder than I expected. "She died peacefully," I said. He shrugged. "Records can be interpreted." I stepped closer. "Careful," he warned. "No," I said quietly. "You be careful." I recited her medical history from memory. Dates, physicians, lab results. Every single thing that had been reviewed and re-reviewed years ago, when grief had driven me to doubt reality itself. His smile faltered. "I keep records," I continued. "You should have checked." He backed away, melted into the street like he'd never been there. That was the last threat I received. Not because the danger was gone, because the balance had shifted. By winter, the network was no longer just reactive. It was preventative. Hospitals updated protocols. Banks revised escalation rules. Judges attended closed-door briefings on coercive family dynamics. No press releases. No victory laps. Just fewer calls that began with panic. Then, in January, the letter arrived. This one had a return address. Evan's handwriting. I almost didn't open it. But I did. I don't expect a reply. He wrote, "I just wanted you to know I'm in therapy. Real therapy, not the kind Sabrina picked." I read it twice. "I don't blame you anymore. I blame myself. I was weak before I was cruel." At the bottom, a final line. "If you ever want to talk, I'll listen." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer, not as evidence, as a reminder. Spring returned slowly. The city felt lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted and not yet replaced. One afternoon, as I was leaving the center, Elaine Mercer waved me over. "You hear about the bill?" she asked. I hadn't. New legislation. Quietly passed. Enhanced penalties for financial exploitation involving medical coercion. The language was unmistakably drawn from the cases we'd helped expose. I stood there longer than necessary, watching traffic move. "This doesn't make you feel better, does it?" Elaine asked gently. "No," I said. "It makes me feel responsible." She nodded. "That's different." That night, alone in my house, I opened a drawer and laid everything out one last time. The vial bag, the letters, the notes, the first thank you card. I didn't put them back. I sealed them in a box and labeled it simply, "Closed." Then I sat at my desk and opened a new notebook. Blank pages. The phone rang once. I answered. "Yes," I said. "Tell me what's going on." And as the voice on the other end began to speak, I understood something with absolute clarity. This story hadn't been about survival. It had been about succession, not of money, of vigilance. And someone, somewhere, was about to test whether that vigilance still held. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, but the pause before the voice spoke told me everything I needed to know. "Mr. Hale," the woman said, careful, rehearsed. "My name is Renata Alvarez. I was told you might understand what's happening to me." I closed the notebook without writing a word. "Start at the beginning." I said. She did, slowly, methodically, like someone who had already learned that rushing only made things worse. Her father was 79, former machinist, widowed, mild tremor in his left hand, nothing more. 2 months ago, her brother moved back into the house to help. 3 weeks later, doctors began receiving revised medication lists they hadn't approved. Last week, Renata discovered a guardianship petition already filed, signed, notarized, and scheduled for emergency review. "They say he's confused," she said, "but he remembers everything. He just doesn't understand why his own son keeps taking his phone away." I wrote one word in the notebook. Pattern. We met the next morning at the center. Her father came too. He walked slowly, but his eyes were sharp. Curious. Unafraid. "They think I won't notice." he said once we were alone. But I do. I just didn't know what to do with it. I handed him a pen. Tell me what feels wrong, I said. He filled 4 pages. Dates, names, small details that didn't add up. I felt that familiar tightening behind my eyes. Not anger. Focus. By noon, Martin had pulled the court file. By dusk, the petition was suspended. By the end of the week, Renata's brother had hired an attorney. By the end of the month, he'd vanished. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Just silence. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't before. We weren't just dismantling schemes. We were disrupting expectations. For decades, people like Sabrina had relied on 2 assumptions: that the elderly would doubt themselves, and that no one would connect the dots fast enough to stop the process once it began. Both assumptions were failing, and failure breeds escalation. It came quietly. A change in tone. Less paperwork. More pressure. Doctors reported being threatened with complaints. Bank managers received anonymous tips questioning their licenses. One social worker resigned after her tires were slashed in a parking garage. The ecosystem was adapting. So we did too. We stopped reacting case by case. We mapped. I spent weeks with spreadsheets that looked nothing like finances and everything like behavior. Shared attorneys. Overlapping clinics. Repeat witnesses. Martin called it constellation analysis. I called it accounting. You don't find fraud by staring at one transaction. You find it by watching what repeats. One name kept resurfacing. Not as a principal. Never directly. Always one step removed. A consultant. A fixer. Someone families were referred to when things got complicated. His name was never spelled the same way twice. But the phone number stayed consistent. I didn't call it. Instead, I waited. The invitation arrived in March. A symposium on aging with dignity. Private attendance. Limited seating. Panel discussions with legal and medical professionals. My name was handwritten on the envelope. No return address. Inside was a schedule and a single card. Your perspective would be valuable. I showed it to Martin. He studied it for a long time. They want to see you, he said finally. Measure you. Then I'll let them, I replied. The event was held at a boutique hotel on the river. Tasteful, discreet, expensive without being loud. I wore the gray suit, the one I used when I wanted to disappear into competence. The room was full of professionals, people who spoke in careful language and avoided absolutes. I recognized 3 faces immediately. 2 attorneys I'd crossed paths with. One doctor who quietly reversed course on a suspicious case after an anonymous tip. And then I saw him, mid-50s, immaculate posture, hands folded loosely as if nothing ever surprised him. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. He waited until the first panel ended to approach me. Mr. Hale, he said, extending a hand. Julian Mercer. I shook it. Interesting work you've been doing, he continued, creating quite a stir. I'm not trying to, I said. It just happens. He laughed softly. That's what everyone says. We spoke in pleasantries, safe topics, the weather, the venue. Then he leaned in just enough that only I could hear. You're disrupting systems that took years to refine. Then they were fragile, I replied. His smile thinned. Be careful, he said. Systems don't like being exposed. They defend themselves. I've noticed, I said. He studied me for a long moment. Do you know why you're still alive? He asked quietly. I met his gaze. Because they miscalculated, I said. For the first time, his composure cracked. Just a flicker. But it was enough. The symposium ended without incident. The danger didn't. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was a copy of my wife's autopsy report. Highlighted. Notes scribbled in the margins. Questions that had already been answered years ago. Resurfaced deliberately. I didn't panic. I didn't call the police. I called Martin. They're bluffing, he said after reviewing the scans. There's nothing here. I know, I said, but they want me to feel watched. That night, I sat in the dark longer than usual. Not afraid. Assessing. Julian Mercer hadn't threatened me. He'd reminded me of something worse. That information, even when false, could still wound. So I changed tactics. I stopped being quiet. Not loud. Visible. I testified at hearings. Consulted openly. Let my name appear in places it hadn't before. If they wanted me isolated, I'd do the opposite. Julian disappeared from public records 2 months later. Shell companies dissolved. Phone numbers disconnected. But the damage had already been done. Evidence compiled. Referrals traced. Cases reopened. By summer, indictments began landing. Not for murder. Not even for attempted murder. For fraud. Conspiracy. Coercion. The boring charges. The ones that stick. I was sitting on my porch the day the news broke. No cameras. No calls. Just a quiet headline scrolling across my phone. Regional Elder Exploitation Network dismantled after multi-year investigation. I didn't celebrate. I breathed. Because systems don't collapse all at once. They crumble. And the people caught inside them don't always fall cleanly. Evan called that night. First time in years. I saw the news, he said. I figured you would. A pause. I'm proud of you, he said. The words landed softly. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. That's enough, I replied. After we hung up, I opened the notebook again. Wrote one final sentence. Balance restored is not peace, but it's the beginning of it. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. And somewhere, someone else was realizing that the rules they relied on no longer applied. The question wasn't whether this work would continue. It was who would take it further. And whether they'd be ready when the next quiet glass of water was offered at a holiday table. The first thing that changed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses on your ears until you realize it isn't absence at all, but restraint. Like something holding its breath. For weeks after the indictments, nothing happened. No calls. No warnings. No shadows lingering too long at the curb. Even the background hum of anxiety that had become familiar began to fade. That was when I knew it wasn't over. When predators scatter, the careful ones don't run. They wait. The call came on a Sunday afternoon while I was repairing a loose hinge on the back door. Unknown number. No hesitation this time when I answered. You're difficult to replace, the voice said. Male. Older. Calm. I'm not for sale, I replied. A quiet chuckle. That's not what I meant. I tightened the screw, listening. You've cost a lot of people a lot of money, he continued. And something else they value even more. Control, I said. Yes, he agreed. That. I stood up slowly. What do you want? I asked. Perspective, he said. Yours. The address he gave was local. A restaurant I hadn't visited in years. Old brick. White tablecloths. The kind of place that relied on reputation instead of advertising. I told Martin where I was going. He didn't argue. Take notes, he said. The man was already seated when I arrived. Late 60s. Navy blazer. Wedding ring worn thin. He stood when he saw me. Call me Henry, he said. We ordered coffee. Nothing else. I used to do what Julian did, he said without preamble. Before Julian. I waited. There's a lie people like us tell ourselves, he continued. That we're managing chaos. That we're preventing worse outcomes. And you believed it, I said. I did, he admitted. Until my sister stopped answering my calls. The word sister shifted something in the air. She was 82. Lived alone. Sharp as a tack. One fall, one hospital stay, one new advisor. And suddenly I was being told to schedule visits. He looked down at his hands. She died 3 months later. Natural causes, they said. I said nothing. I recognized the paperwork, he continued. The language, the cadence. I helped design it. Why tell me? I asked. Because you did something I couldn't, he said. You survived long enough to break the machine. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were names. Dates. Shell entities layered so deep they looked fictional. This is what's left, he said. The quiet ones. Why not give this to the authorities? I asked. He met my eyes. Because they don't know where to look yet. You do. I closed the folder. Then why are you still free? I asked. He smiled sadly. Because I stopped before it was illegal. Just unethical. We finished our coffee in silence. When I stood to leave, he said one last thing. They're watching you again. I assumed as much, I replied. This time, he added, it's not about money. That night, the dream returned. Not the kitchen, not the vial, the dining room, the moment before the glass touched my lips. I woke before dawn and couldn't go back to sleep. By morning, the center had received 3 new calls. All different, all familiar. One from a woman whose mother's medications had been adjusted without explanation. One from a man whose uncle's house was suddenly listed for sale. One from a nurse who'd been asked to sign off on a diagnosis she hadn't made. Henry's list was already proving accurate. The quiet ones were moving. So we did something new. We didn't intervene. We observed, tracked responses, recorded delays, watched who made the calls after resistance was introduced. It took 10 days. Then a name surfaced. Not Julian. Someone better. Someone who didn't touch paperwork. Just outcomes. Her name was Mariel Boone. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No obvious connections. But every time she appeared, families fractured faster. She specialized in proximity, volunteering, church groups, care circles, the people no one questioned. I attended a support group she ran under a false name, sat in the back, listened. Her voice was soft. Her advice always framed as empathy. You don't want to wait until it's too late, she told the room. Regret is heavier than guilt. I felt something cold settle in my chest. After the meeting, she approached me. You look tired, she said kindly. Caregiving does that. I'm not a caregiver, I replied. She smiled. Not yet. The next morning, Evan showed up at my door, unannounced, uncertain. I think someone followed me, he said. I let him in. He hadn't been threatened. Not directly. Just questions. Subtle ones. About me. About my health. About whether I was still sharp. I didn't tell him about Mariel. I didn't need to. He already felt it. They're testing boundaries. I said, seeing who flinches. I didn't, he replied. I nodded. Good. That afternoon, I filed paperwork I'd hoped never to need. Advanced directives. Medical proxies. Redundancies layered until interference would be obvious. Visibility again. By evening, the call stopped. Mariel canceled her next 3 meetings. 2 weeks later, she relocated. No farewell. No forwarding address. But the damage was incomplete. She'd been interrupted. And interruptions leave traces. Martin smiled for the first time in days when the warrant came through. Conspiracy. Coercive control. Identity misrepresentation. Not enough to erase the harm she'd caused. Enough to end her reach. The night before the arrest, I sat alone at the dining table. Set a single glass in front of me. Empty. I thought about how many times trust had been weaponized quietly. Not with force. With kindness. With timing. With patience. I didn't drink. I stood, turned off the light, and went to bed. When the sun rose, my phone buzzed once. It was Martin. It's done, he said. I looked out the window. The street was calm. Children walking to school. A dog pulling its owner toward the park. Ordinary life, resuming. Not healed, but intact. And somewhere, someone else was realizing that the easiest way to take something from an older person was no longer silence. Because silence had learned how to speak. The arrest didn't bring relief. It brought attention. The kind that doesn't knock. Within 48 hours, the center's inbox doubled. Not pleas, warnings. People who hadn't been harmed yet, but felt the shift. A neighbor suddenly too helpful. A relative asking about paperwork that had never mattered before. New devices installed for safety. New routines suggested for convenience. Patterns repeat when pressure is applied. Always have. I stopped answering calls myself. Not because I was afraid, but because fear clouds judgment, and judgment was all that mattered now. Martin took over triage. Evan handled documentation. I stayed where I'd always been best, behind the curtain, watching how systems react when resistance becomes predictable. That's when the message arrived. No sender, no subject, just a single sentence. You taught them how to hide better. I deleted it without replying. 3 hours later, my bank called. Routine verification. They said, unusual access attempt. Someone had my social security number, my address, my medical provider, and enough personal history to pass the first layer of identity checks. Someone patient. Someone who understood that brute force no longer worked. I thanked the representative, locked the account, and made a note. This wasn't retaliation. This was recruitment pressure. That evening, Evan noticed a drone. Small, commercial, legal, hovering long enough to be curious, not long enough to be obvious. Do we call in? He asked. No, I said, let it watch. People who surveilled don't fear what they can see. They fear what they can interpret. 2 days later, the center's funding offer arrived. Anonymous donor. Significant amount. No strings listed. Martin laughed when he read it. That's not generosity, he said. That's a leash. Exactly, I replied, which means whoever sent it believes we're tired. We declined publicly. The response came faster this time. A reporter called. Then another. Questions framed carefully. Are you exploiting vulnerable seniors for publicity? Have you personally profited from fear? Is this vendetta masquerading as advocacy? I'd spent my life in rooms where language was weaponized. I recognized the cadence immediately. Someone was testing reputation erosion, so I gave them nothing. No interviews. No statements. Silence again, but controlled. That night, I dreamed of ledgers, pages flipping by themselves, numbers balancing, then shifting when no one touched them. I woke before dawn with one certainty. They were no longer trying to remove me. They were trying to replace me. The call came from an unexpected place. A woman named Ruth Calder, former probate judge, retired quietly 5 years earlier. I saw your name, she said, attached to a filing that shouldn't exist. I listened. There's a private arbitration body, she continued. They operate parallel to courts, offer family mediation services. Their rulings aren't legally binding, but banks, hospitals, and insurers treat them as advisory. That shouldn't be possible, I said. It shouldn't, she agreed. But it is, and someone has been feeding them pre-decisions. My pen stopped moving. They're preparing a narrative, she continued. One where resistance looks like instability. The words landed heavier than any threat. Guardianship doesn't begin with courts. It begins with doubt. How many cases? I asked. 37 in 18 months, she said. All dismissed eventually, but not before assets moved. Who's behind it? I asked. She paused. That's why I called. She sent the file an hour later. The name at the center wasn't Mariel, wasn't Julian. It was a firm, Hale and Mercer Advisory. No website, no branding, just shell partnerships and consulting invoices, and one familiar signature on every internal memo. Henry. The folder from the restaurant resurfaced in my mind. What's left? I called him. He answered immediately. You said you were out. I said, I am, he replied. That doesn't mean they are. You didn't tell me you built the replacement. I said. I didn't, he said quietly. I warned them against it. Why come to me at all? I asked. Because you're not transactional, he said. And they are. Silence stretched between us. They're planning something public, he continued. A test case. Someone visible. Someone credible. I knew who before he finished. Me, I said, yes. That night, I didn't sleep. I reviewed every directive, every safeguard, every redundancy, and found the flaw. Not legal, social, perception. They didn't need to win a case. They needed enough people to wonder if I should be trusted. Morning came with rain. Heavy, cleansing, unforgiving. The call arrived at 9:14 a.m. Adult Protective Services. Routine wellness check. They said, 2 officers. Polite. Calm. They asked questions they already had answers to. They looked for hesitation, confusion, deflection. They didn't find it. Still, the report was filed. Observation recommended. Not action, but observation opens doors. When they left, Evan slammed his notebook shut. They're escalating, he said. Yes, I replied, which means they're close. Close to what? He asked. To making a mistake. The mistake came 3 days later. A letter, certified, formal, impeccably worded. Petition for preliminary evaluation, filed by Hale and Mercer. Basis, pattern of undue influence over vulnerable populations. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, because it was lazy. They'd reused language from a previous case, one Ruth Calder had presided over. I sent her the document. Her reply was immediate. They're arrogant. That afternoon we moved, not defensively, offensively. Every call logged, every message time-stamped. We released nothing publicly. Instead, we filed a counter-motion quietly. Request for disclosure, full client list, advisory history, internal communications. They objected within the hour, which told me everything. 2 days later, the hearing was scheduled. Closed session, small room, no audience, just enough space for truth to have nowhere to hide. I wore the same jacket I'd worn to the hospital months earlier. Familiar things steady the hands. Henry sat across from me. He didn't meet my eyes. When the judge entered, I felt something settle. Not fear. Finality. Hale and Mercer's attorney spoke first. Smooth, confident, concerned, painted me as brilliant, but obsessed. A man unable to let go. I waited. When it was my turn, I didn't speak immediately. I placed one document on the table, then another, then a third. Insurance payouts, property transfers, advisory fees disguised as support services. Patterns don't lie. People do. The judge leaned forward. Henry finally looked up. I met his gaze. You warned them, I said softly. You didn't stop them. He swallowed. They wouldn't listen. No, I corrected. They didn't think they needed to. The ruling wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. Just a pause. Then, petition dismissed. Followed by something better. Referral for investigation. As we stood to leave, Henry spoke. You could have destroyed us, he said. I still can, I replied. But that's not the point. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air felt different. Not safe, but cleaner. Evan exhaled slowly. Is it over? He asked. I thought about the ledger. About balance. No, I said, but it's quieter now. That night, I sat alone again. The glass still empty. But for the first time, I wasn't waiting. I was watching. Because the most dangerous moment isn't when someone strikes. It's when they realize they can't. Silence is never empty. It just changes shape. After the hearing, Hale and Mercer vanished the way organizations do when they realize attention has teeth. Phones rang unanswered. Offices closed for restructuring. Websites went dark. On paper, it looked like retreat. In reality, it was compression. When predators can't expand, they consolidate. I knew that. I'd watched it happen in financial collapses, political scandals, corporate fraud. The moment exposure feels inevitable, people stop improvising and start protecting only what matters most. Money, freedom, legacy. 3 days later, Henry called again. This time, his voice was different. Tired, unarmored. They're done fighting you, he said. They're cutting losses. Which ones? I asked. The smart ones. And the rest? He exhaled. They're panicking. Panic creates errors. Errors leave records. Tell me where, I said. He hesitated. If I do this, there's no returning. There never is, I replied. That's the point. He sent the file before midnight. It wasn't a list of names. It was a process map, decision trees, escalation paths, approval shortcuts. The kind of internal documentation consultants use when they assume no one outside the room will ever see it. They had built a system that didn't need malice to function, only compliance. Hospitals flagged non-cooperative seniors. Banks delayed transactions pending review. Legal firms offered protective oversight. All independent, all justified, all coordinated. And at the center of it, Hale and Mercer's advisory loop. They didn't steal. They redirected. 0.5% here. A custody decision there. A signature obtained under pressure, later validated by procedure. Death wasn't required. Just erosion. I sat with the file until morning. Not angry. Focused. Evan arrived just after sunrise. He took one look at my face and said, "You've decided." "Yes," I replied. "We end it." "How?" he asked. "By making it too expensive to exist." We didn't call the press. We didn't alert regulators. We didn't make noise. We made disclosures. Targeted ones. To the right oversight committees. To the right compliance boards. To the right insurers with exposure to advisory liability. We attached receipts. Not accusations. Patterns. Within a week, 3 banks froze partnership reviews. Within two hospital systems quietly suspended external elder advisory referrals. By week 3, Hale and Mercer's remaining clients were asking questions. The kind of questions that require sworn answers. Henry sent one final message. "They're blaming each other now." Good. Blame fractures trust. Trust is the only thing systems like this run on. The last move wasn't mine. It came from Ruth Calder. She testified. Not publicly, privately, before a panel that understood exactly what they were hearing. She didn't dramatize. She explained. And when judges explain systems, people listen. 2 months later, the arbitration body dissolved. No announcement, no scandal, just a line item in a regulatory update. Advisory operations suspended pending review. Hale and Mercer followed within days. Their assets weren't seized. They weren't arrested. They were neutralized, which is worse for people who believe they're untouchable. I expected satisfaction. It didn't come. Instead, there was quiet. The good kind. The kind that lets you hear your own breathing again. Evan asked me one night, "What happens now?" I looked around the office. At the files. At the names. At nothing, I said. "That's the goal." He frowned. "You don't sound done." "I am," I replied. "But systems don't need me anymore." That was true. The center didn't close. It changed. Protocols codified. Safeguards automated. People trained to recognize pressure instead of fear. I stepped back. Not out, just aside. The house felt larger without constant vigilance. I cooked again. Slow meals. Simple things. I walked in the mornings. Watched the neighborhood return to ordinary. No drones. No unfamiliar cars. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. They said you couldn't be stopped. They were wrong. I burned it, not out of fear, out of completion. The ledger at last was balanced, not because everyone paid, but because no one else could profit quietly. That night, I poured a glass. Didn't drink it, just let it sit, because some habits aren't about need. They're about remembering where you started. I thought of my wife, of promises made when life felt simpler, of the boy my son had been before numbers replaced values. I didn't excuse him. I didn't forgive him, but I stopped carrying him. That's the difference. The world didn't change dramatically after that. No headlines, no speeches, just fewer calls like the one I once received. And that was enough. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and for the first time in a long while, I slept, not because the danger was gone, but because I had finished what needed to be done, and nothing was waiting for me anymore. Not even shadows. Before you go, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Your engagement helps more real stories like this find the right audience.